Hey guys, we are here today in Valheim, taking a look at the best food for you to use in the Mistlands. Now previously I've done the best food you can use for each stage of the game, and this video has gone over the different foods you should combine to get the best health, stamina, or overall points. Now we're not doing the same thing for the Mistlands, because the Mistlands has only added 3 new foods for health, stamina, and mana, and it is very clear which ones are the best, and they have an obvious stat difference. Instead, what we're going to be going over today is what combination of foods you should use depending on what playstyle you want to accomplish. And since your health, stamina, and mana are directly tied to what foods you eat, this is essentially the way that Valheim does builds and allows you to select your different playstyles. So we're going to be going over these different builds or playstyles in each category of food type and talk a little bit about what I think they accomplish best and how they are best played. As we talk about each different setup, keep in mind that any playstyle can work with pretty much any weapon. These are just the weapons that I felt fit the best, or I had the most success with while I went through and tested each build. And for ease of remembering each different build and playstyle, I have named them all because I quite enjoy games with advanced class systems, and let's just be honest, it's more fun to have class names on these different builds. Starting out with the health food setups, we're going to talk about the setup that I think is the least effective of the health setups, and that's not to say that it's bad, I just think the other two are a little bit more powerful. And that is equipping all 3 slots with health foods and using what I'm calling the Guardian. I had most of my success with the Guardian with a tower shield, since you have an incredibly high stagger bar and can absorb a lot of damage from multiple targets. Your main hand weapon doesn't really matter, just ideally something on the quicker side and not a one-handed axe, so that you can land as many shots as possible before you need to block again. This build allows a lot of room for mistakes since you have an incredibly high health pool, and if you equip heavy armor, you can take a real beating. It's got very low damage output, and all the fights are very tactical and slow, which might work out for someone who's not too good at dodging or parrying, and is willing to take their time to whittle enemies down slowly. If you are going to use a tower shield, it does an incredible job knocking things back right when it blocks, which allows you to open up opportunities to fight things somewhat one-on-one, and time out your shots so you're taking as little damage as possible. Due to the small stamina pool of the Guardian, you cannot travel around the Mistlands very quickly or jump over large mountains, and it's very important to manage that stamina during combat, and make sure you don't overextend yourself or else you'll be in a lot of trouble. They're especially weak to ticks for this reason, since you need to dodge roll to get out of a tick's bite, and if you don't manage things correctly, you can burn out pretty quickly. What I think is the second best health food setup is using 2 health foods and 1 stamina food, creating what I'm calling the Barbarian. I would still equip heavy armor on your helmet and legs in this setup, but I would equip the root chest piece to give yourself some defense from pierce damage. This can really offset the fact that you're not blocking quite as much with this setup, and allow you to be a little bit more offensive when fighting Seekers. I really enjoyed using Crom for this setup, and trying to maximize your damage output. Any two-handed really works, and although you could go with a shield and parry attacks, I felt like the increased health bar and the root chest piece allowed me to be more offensive, more aggressive, and a little bit reckless. So the shield didn't really fit into that setup. If you do use a two-handed weapon, you have a little bit more increased range and can hit things at a much longer distance. Try to make sure you use this to your advantage as you move around mobs and avoid their attacks. Hit them at the max distance that you can, and you can stay out of trouble for a lot longer. If you've got the right two-handed weapon equipped, you can deal out a lot of damage with this thing, but you've got to be aware that the Barbarian will almost certainly take damage themselves, since the two-handed weapons swing so slowly. And then my number 1 setup, if you want to be on the health foods, is to use 2 health foods and 1 mana food. And this I am calling the Paladin. The Paladin is phenomenal in co-op play, but it can still get the job done even when solo. I like to use a Staff of Protection, which can really capitalize on the only 1 mana food, and allow you to be really offensive with this class while the shield is on. I like to take two-handed weapons, like the Sledgehammer or the Atgear, which pair really well together, and use them for single target and AoE damage. While you have the Staff of Protection shield on, you can be really offensive, really aggressive, and put out a lot of damage in bursts. Now when you're in co-op and you shield your teammates, this can be a huge asset to the group, and this may be one of the best classes to take into a co-op situation. The reason I like to take two-handed weapons when you're using the Staff of Protection is because even if you parry or block something with a shield, your magic barrier still takes the damage as well, and it really wastes opportunities you could have taken to swing yourself. Now parrying obviously still has a huge advantage of staggering the enemy and opening up critical hits, and you'll likely be trying to capitalize on that anyway in those periods that you don't have a magic barrier on. The thing to keep in mind with the Paladin is they're not really good against big targets like Seeker soldiers. One hit from these guys can break your barrier, And since the staff protection drains your own hit points in order to fuel it, you can't just keep it up all the time. Makes these fights a little bit tougher and hard to manage against things that hit really hard, at least while you're solo. Now we can go ahead and move on to the stamina builds. And the bottom section for me in this category is equipping all 3 stamina foods, creating what I'm deeming the Ranger. If you do decide to equip all 3 stamina foods, you have a lot of energy and incredibly high mobility, especially if you tandem it with Fenris armor and a root chest piece. But with such low hit points, you really have almost no room for error and can't really get up to any melee situations at all. This is ideal for people who want to strictly play an archer and maybe carry arrows for any different situation. This is really good in co-op, but it can be tough to solo with, especially in the Mistlands, where the terrain can be punishing and the enemies can be resistant to piercing. If you play with this setup for the Ranger, it's a good thing to try and take your time in the Mistlands and utilize your sneak attack with the bow to deal some damage to enemies before they see you. Again, this can be difficult with the mist as well, but it's the best way to gain an advantage in combat. The Ranger can really handle themselves with Jaw, since they have the energy to keep firing at their weak spot. But due to the weak defense and the poor ability to handle multiple enemies, they really struggle with Seekers in general, and do really terrible inside of dungeons. Obviously, you need to bring some form of melee weapon, and I recommend a shield with this since you will get into melee situations at one time or another. You've got the energy to get ticks off of you, and parry plenty of attacks, so one-on-one situations are just fine, but once you have 2 targets in the area, if the second target hits you while you're trying to land a critical shot on the first, you'll be in a lot of trouble. So if you decide to play the Ranger, try to utilize a slow and steady pace when you're out in the open, and if you get into any dungeons or infested mines, make sure you bring a lot of health potions and be ready to take off and leave at any moment. My second best setup for the stamina builds is the Scion, which is 2 stamina foods and 1 mana food. Similar to the Paladin, I would bring a Staff of Protection, but instead of bringing 200 weapons, I would use knives. Utilize this speed to move around quickly with Fenris armor and again a root harness, and take the small sections that you have staff protection on to deal high burst damage. The leap attack from the knives can stagger most Seekers and open you up to kill them really quickly. You can handle Jaw decently with this class as well, given that they have the stamina capacity to dodge and use a bow for long periods. The biggest thing you need to be aware of if you decide to play the Scion is you have got to manage combat when you do not have a magic barrier up really carefully. They have almost no hit points, and outside the root harness, they have terrible defense. So if you put yourself in a bad spot and you do not have a magic barrier on, you can die very quickly. Utilize the terrain to your advantage and your stamina pool in order to set yourself up with some decent distance until you get your next Staff of Protection cast off. My top setup for stamina builds is the Assassin, which will be 2 stamina foods and 1 health food. Again, I would equip 2 Fenris pieces of gear and the root harness, giving yourself just that little bit of defense. That, coupled with the higher health pool, allows you to be up in the pocket for longer periods. If you go with the dual knives in this situation and use your high mobility, you can really put out some damage on a lot of enemies. The Assassin is even pretty decent at handling multiple targets, as long as you focus them down one at a time and get the numbers in your favor. I think the Assassin is one of the higher skill classes in the game, because even though you have a higher health pool and some defense to pierce, your main system for putting out damage is in that melee range, which means you have very little room for error and you gotta be right on time with your dodges and your parries. Keep in mind that the knives actually parry better than you probably think, since they have a 4 times parry bonus, and if you time it correctly, they can handle most of the small mobs that you'll fight. The Assassin is also one of the best builds I think against Seeker soldiers. If you simply kite around and wait until they do their double slam attack, it gives you a lot of time to get to their back with the knives and the movement speed, and put out some massive damage in the form of backstabs. And now we can move on to our mana builds, with the least effective build in my opinion being 2 mana foods and 1 health food, creating the Necromancer. The Necromancer is actually pretty safe to play in any content, as long as you travel slowly through the biomes and don't rush yourself or burn out of energy, since your stamina pool is incredibly low. If you equip some heavy armor, since you don't need the mana regen from the Eitr gear, and then also bring along a tower shield, this is a really tanky build. It can lack good range capability since you don't have the energy to draw a bow very good, and I don't particularly recommend bringing a Staff of Embers or Frost, although that is an option, since it's built around using the Staff of Protection and the Dead Razor in order to build skeletons to do most of the fighting for you, while you tank it with a tower shield, and using the Staff of Protection to guard those skeletons and yourself in short bursts. It's fairly simple to play, and doesn't require any parrying or even really any dodging. I recommend taking a knife with the tower shield since it swings the fastest and can actually land in some shots in between blocks. Not to mention the knife can really utilize things to your advantage against creatures like Seeker Soldiers and backstab them really quickly while your skeletons have the aggro. There's a lot of kiting with this class or blocking with your tower shield while you wait for a little bit of mana to regen or some health to regen in order to summon more skeletons or put up another barrier. Big hitters like Seeker Soldiers can kill these skeletons really fast, so those fights might be slow and tedious while you spawn one skeleton at a time to land some backstabs yourself. But against large groups of Seekers, you can actually handle yourself pretty decently, as long as you have your skeletons up and barrier before you or your pets take too much damage during the cast times. The second most effective setup, I think, in the mana category would be what I'm calling the Wizard, and that is equipping all 3 mana foods. The Wizard is incredibly good in co-op when you have someone else to fight the mobs up close or get their attention. With your incredibly high mana pool, and using a Staff of Embers and a Staff of Frost, you can fire off a lot of shots and probably put out the most damage in the game. The Wizard can struggle a lot with solo play since you don't have a lot of energy to dodge any attacks, and you have a terrible health pool, along with the fact that I recommend bringing all the Eitr regen armor, which means you're missing out on the Rune Harness. The Wizard is probably one of the higher skill classes in the game, since you have very little room for error, or maybe even no room for error. If you get caught low on stamina, or low on health, you will certainly be dead. You've got to kite things really strategically, use your Staff of Frost to slow them down in really good spots, and time out when you're going to fire your attacks. Now what I do really enjoy about the mana builds is that you don't use your stamina to attack at all, since your staffs use strictly mana, which means your stamina bar is just a defensive tool. You can use it to dodge attacks way more often than a stamina build, and you can fire attacks regardless of how often you're dodging, which is a really nice touch. Just keep in mind with the Wizard that you need to be completely aware of your surroundings and where every mob is so you don't get blindsided or run into a bad spot that will burn your stamina down due to the terrain. The other thing I'd keep in mind with the Wizard is it takes a lot of potion upkeep since you have such small health and stamina pools, and you'll probably need to replenish them in a key situation, along with the fact that you will likely need to take multiple Staff of Embers or multiple Staff of Frosts since they are your only weapon option, and you'll eat through the durability on your weapons pretty quickly, so just make sure you have a backup. Which brings us to what I think is the best mana setup, which is 2 mana foods and 1 stamina food, which I am calling the Elementalist. I do recommend with this build, again, bringing the full Eitr gear setup and getting the maximum amount of mana regen you can, which leaves you without a Root Harness, and that automatically makes this a pretty high skill build. You gotta make sure you're on time with your dodging, and can avoid hits altogether. Thankfully, you do have a larger stamina pool, which allows you to dodge a lot more than the Wizard, even if you put out a little bit less damage. The biggest reason the Elementalist is preferred for me over the Wizard is the Lightning Polearm being equipped on your bar. And yes, it doesn't really matter which polearm it is, or frankly whatever melee weapon it is, but I love the theme of the Elementalist having fire, ice, and lightning. This also allows the Elementalist to be able to always be attacking and constantly be putting out damage, especially in a group scenario since you have 2 resource bars. Burn up your mana using the Staff of Embers, and then flip over to your polearm right when you run out, and you never have to stop attacking. This class has incredibly good agility, and the ability to have offense and defense rolling at the same time when you're playing solo, and then it is the class that never needs to take a break at all when you're playing in a group setting. You just have to be in that medium range where you can switch from melee to range at any given moment. They're the most versatile class in this group, and my personal favorite. That's why you'll likely have noticed that throughout a lot of my videos in the Mistlands, this is how I'm playing the game. Now this brings us to the black sheep of the group, and the one that doesn't fit in any category: 1 health, 1 stamina, and 1 mana food, which I am calling the Outrider. Originally this was a setup I thought would not be very effective or work well, since it's a jack of all trades and a master of none. But I'm actually surprised to say that testing it out, it worked pretty decently. I do recommend, like the rest of the 1 mana food classes, to take a Staff of Protection to utilize that small mana pool. The Outrider can really handle any situation, as long as you have your skills built up for the weapons you're using. It can bring along a sword and a shield to handle things like Seeker Soldiers or big hitting mobs pretty well. Take a 2-handed weapon with you as well, along with Staff of Protection to handle group AoE situations or large hordes of mobs. And they can still handle itself against Jaw by making sure that you also bring a bow. The Outrider clearly doesn't excel at any one situation and requires a lot of hotbar space in order to equip weapons for any given enemy, but if you're really not sure what to expect and want to be prepared for anything that comes at you, the Outrider actually might be a pretty good option. I'd make sure you bring along a root harness, and then you can mix the other pieces to fit your particular playstyle, whether you want some speed from Fenris or the extra defense from heavy armor. But this actually is not a bad class to try out, and is probably one of the better solo classes there is. Now obviously, all of this is from personal experience. I recommend you play a couple of these classes yourself and see what you get the feel for. You also might want to switch up some of the weapons I recommend, depending on the class and depending on your personal skill level. Now keep in mind that all these classes can have different levels of effectiveness for different people. If you don't feel like you have great response times, or good at dodging or parrying attacks, then the Guardian is going to be much more effective for you than the Assassin, and will actually net better results. On the opposite side of that, if you feel like you want to work at a faster pace, and you're pretty good at timing your attacks and your defense, you'll want to take something a little more reckless like the Wizard or the Ranger, as opposed to the slow and steady pace of the Necromancer. Pick what fits your playstyle more, and don't feel like there's a wrong class to select, because all of them can handle themselves and work in the right situation by the right person. These right here are my personal ranks for each of the classes, and what I think I had the most fun with, or the most effectiveness with, since they fit my playstyle a bit more. You will probably notice throughout a lot of it, I recommend the Root Harness a lot, and there's only a few classes I think shouldn't take it, since it is the incredibly effective piece in the Mistlands. I also recommend Eitr as the Forsaken power you take almost in every situation, since stamina is king, and moving around the terrain or sprinting away from a fight can really save you. Bone Mass is also an option in my opinion, if you're doing one of the setups that are wearing full Eitr gear, and you really need the physical defense when you get swarmed by Seekers. This in fact is what I did while playing the Elementalist, and I just try to manage my stamina a little better. I would recommend, however, not taking Yaglith, since you can easily offset this with fire resistance mead, and the fire damage creatures in the Mistlands you fight are not there all that often. Hopefully this video was helpful to you, can give you an idea of what it is that you want to play, or how best to play the setup you're currently in. Let me know down in the comments on what is your favorite build, tips on how to play them, or what you have found effective or not effective while battling enemies in the Mistlands, so that we can get the best information out there as possible for all the other players, and we can build to more successful Valheim runs. Thanks for watching, I will see you next time.